Good evening, welcome, happy Christmas. It should be quite fun in this intimate venue to have a little chat about GCHQ and surveillance that can be more whimsical at points than the more severe talks I usually do. As Joe's mentioned, we've got a slight difficulty in the venue's extraneous noise, which at other times we would regard as useful masking for having really significant conversations that we at least thought was important. But that's why I'm microphoned up, otherwise I could normally project. The title that Joe suggested for this talk is GCHQ and Me. And it was a happy syllogism because just a month or two ago, the author who's done more than anybody else in the world to bring NSA out in the last 30 years, as I have been doing for GCHQ, James Bamford, was invited to write a piece called NSA and Me for The Intercept magazine, which is recently launched, funded on internet millions of dollars, and putting out stories on civil liberties, but particularly stories that derive from the many, many documents provided by the bounty of Edward Snowden. Later on in this talk, I'm going to come to some of the Snowden materials and how they feed back and enlarge on the stories I tell. But I've been asked to tell a reminiscence. And in a magnificent coincidence or arrangement, The Intercept has asked me to tell my story. I've written it up at huge length. It's being edited on a train between New York and Washington even now, as I understand it. We're going to try and get it out on Friday. And if we get it out on Friday, there'll be some interesting final statements that relate directly to what I'm talking about here. Sadly, they have to wait. We have to wait and see what the timetable is. And it'll come out, if not on Friday, a few days later. But I wanted to start this talk by revealing a British Secret Service plot that's never been revealed before. The elements in the spirit of Christmas I'll have to lay out to you in the form of Cluedo pieces, and you can work out what Colonel B did to Mrs. C in the cupboard of the Bletchley Annex, or whatever. But this is a dastardly and far-sighted plot, not even thought of by James Bond villains, because it was a plot, I now realize, to stop me ever being born. And I turn to the first exhibit. But before I do, that's the author, back in the 70s. This, although I didn't know it at the time, was the hardware that marked the very start of the age of automated mass surveillance that we now know so about. And this is the article I wrote for London's Time Out magazine with a co-author in 1976, bringing GCHQ to attention for the first time. We'll come to mastering the internet. That chap is a British general, but his secret story is that he moved out of the army and ran the dirty tricks special operations executive in the middle years of the war, and then became an assistant chief of the Secret Service, SIS. He wrote this. It's a poem. It's obviously about SIGINT. Meet our megacycle Mary, where the dipoles cluster tall. Would I knew the grid potential of our Mary's thermionic, calculated by differential, why her voice is supersonic. If her frequency reaction could but oscillate with mine, it would give much satisfaction, for she's super heterodyne. So, yeah. He died in 1985. So we have somebody who knows about radio, with something to do with spookery, and there's a character called Mary. This is Mary in her later years. And she worked alongside, who's this? Who's seen the film? Hands up. Okay. It's a bit ropey, but that's the one. So now I've got you confused. It all happened at a country house here. That's it in the Second World War. Country house, radio aerials, huts. It's not Bletchley Park. Anybody know where this place is? Somebody say? Hanslope. No. Yep. This is confirmed by a usually very unreliable source. That's the modern incarnation of Hanslope Park from the red just a year or so ago. And it's not quite got it right, but it's more or less it. It's the communication centre for the British Secret Intelligence Service. And yes, it's probably where the equivalent of Q hangs out. So I'll put the pieces together. That's my mother. And she did work alongside Alan Turing, who came over from Bletchley to Hanslope. He was then going to design a speech encipherment system. He liked the quiet, and he was directed to my mother because she was a mathematician by training, and somebody thought that their standard of maths might match, which they didn't. But there's a lot of conversations, and if you read the book that's inspired the Imitation Game film by Andrew Hodges, it thanks my mother, it thanks me for helping write that book way, way back in 1980. So Marshal Cornwall had just been appointed as assistant chief. He met my mother at Hanslope Park, where she was working on stuff she didn't even know what she was doing. He obviously expressed certain emotions, which, if they had been carried through, would certainly mean that I would not be here now, and none of what I'm going to talk about would have happened. In 1993, they brought in a new Intelligence Services Act, part of which, although it replaced the Official Secrets Act under which I was prosecuted, coming to that, it would have recriminalized talking to people who'd worked for the intelligence services. Now, it actually took 25 years after the war before my mother and I could actually work out what she did. All that I knew from what she told us is that she was tracking down signals in occupied cities. And it was only actually by doing investigative journalism that I was actually able to figure out she didn't even work for GCHQ, but she worked for the Secret Service. We were trying to track down money she was entitled to after the war, and as my knowledge increased, I said, try Cheltenham, and they said no. And we then tried the Foreign Office, and they said, yeah. And there's a lot of history out there now. Although she wore the King's uniform, she was never in the army. And she didn't know that even really till the day she died. I wrote this story because it was an ostensible violation of the new law, but it was a lot of fun. That's me. This is where I started coming in with the eavesdroppers and writing about global interception. And this was rapidly to result in a major political secrecy trial of the 1970s. But it didn't start with my mum. It actually started when I was a wee schoolboy in Dundee in Scotland. And across the River Tay, the Silvery Tay, there were things in the Kingdom of Fife that caught our interest. And one day, I think I will have been 15 or 16, I got on my bicycle with another science SWATty student who was a friend. And we were cycling over, and let's go and look at that radio station on top of the hill. And this is it now, with the masts coming down, a bit derelict, lots of air conditioning on top. And there's a sign. I just found this picture on the internet today. There's a wooden sign there. And in, was it 1968? That said CSOS Hawklaw. And I'm the wee 16-year-old with my mate, and we're curious. We're both radio amateurs, so we kind of get what we're looking at. But it doesn't look like a broadcast station. It's not the post office. It's not stuff we know. So this is the next component of the picture. And this. the bicycle and the chip shop. We cycled down the hill and went into the chip shop at the bottom, had some chips and said, "What do they do at that radio station up the hill?" "Oh, that's awfully secret. They never talk. They come down for the chips every shift, but they never say what they're doing." And I go, And back at school, I went to the public library, where they had racks of telephone directories right across the country. And in my lunchtimes, I went through every phone book looking up CSOS. And one of them, it said CSOS and what it stood for. So it said Composite Signal Organization. So I looked up that as well. And by the time I'd finished, I got a map of 12 or 15 very interesting locations across Britain. And then I forgot all about it. Went to university, did a physics degree at Oxford, and then, we'll come back to that, and then approached Time Out when some American whistleblowers were coming over to the UK, and we got the chance to start talking about what really happened in electronic listening. Just to show the change that has now happened, if you type CSOS Hawklaw into the internet, it tells you straight away that it's a wireless intercept station with maps, plans, and it is now, for goodness sake, an ancient and historical monument of Scotland. I will not speak to anyone who dares to suggest that I too should be an ancient and historical monument of Scotland. So that is one of the components which then became at the heart of a major security proceedings. And there we are, right inside. In fact, did they have sofas operationally? Who knows? There is the map that we published in 1976 in Time Out. And the reaction when that magazine was first published was fairly small. Nobody got very excited about it. Publicly. Privately, they were incensed. I later had sources who were working at an overseas listening station who recalled the local head of GCHQ's interception coming to the morning intelligence meeting, literally, he tells me, frothing at the mouth. And asked to explain if he was ill or unwell, he hurled down a text of the eavesdropper's article that had been sent over from Cheltenham a few hours earlier. It was like his world had fallen apart. Their secrecy had been consummate and absolute. And for years, they tried to keep that the way right through, as we know, to the appalling events not far from here in the basement of the Guardian's offices, where they forced the staff of the Guardian to destroy the memory cards that contained Edward Snowden's files. It hasn't died, it hasn't changed a bit. The consequences were not immediately felt. I had, when I started the article, called up Cheltenham and said, "Could I speak to the press office?" Now, these days, if you go onto the website, there's press office, call press office, numbers, people. When I called Cheltenham and asked for the press office in 1976, as I recall, the poor telephonist nearly fell off a chair. And then, after some thinking and consultation, decided that perhaps I could speak to the librarian, who was terribly polite and took down my questions, and there were no answers. What I now know is that within about 2 days, the wires were attached to my phone. That bit I detected. MI5's watchers were put on to me round the clock to see what I was doing, and they were brilliant. They weren't like the people you see in the movies. I never spotted a single trace of that activity. But I know years later from inside and from people I was interviewing that they were later approached and the meetings had been watched and everything like that. But that had a bizarre consequence. The director of GCHQ had moved on to a superintelligence chief and post in the cabinet office, and I was told by one source that when the head of the special branch, abolished now but the security police, came and presented the results of all the surveillance that had been done on me after publication, he had to say, "I'm sorry, but he hasn't actually broken the law, because nothing that we've found out came from somebody with classified information. and we know he talked to Americans, but they're not covered by the Official Secrets Act. It was a bit like Snowden repleased 40 years earlier. And, of course, they didn't know where the map had come from, and in their comparted mind, that had to mean there was real secrets. They couldn't come at us, so they went at somebody else instead. They selected my co-author, who was an American journalist, and said, "You'll be deported from Britain as a threat to national security." And they threw in another whistleblower who'd come out of the CIA. In the middle of that, somebody who'd worked on the listening station in Cyprus came forward, and we went to interview them one dark February night up in Menwith Hill, a long 3-hour conversation. And when we came out of the darkness, about 8 police officers crowded in on us, and they said that they had suspicions under Section 2 of the Official Secrets Act. Now, some of you may remember Section 2 of the Official Secrets Act. It was a ridiculous law which passed in the panic before the First World War, criminalized everything to do with getting government information. It was the antithesis of the modern idea of accountability and freedom of information. And everything was covered, even the canteen menus or the farm subsidies. But it had been embarrassed by a prosecution, ironically, of Jonathan Aitken, now himself a bit discredited, in 1970. The new governments at the time had promised to repeal it, and the Home Secretary himself had said just 8 days before that they were committed to repealing this law. And here were policemen saying, "We're going to feel your collar under this law, Sonny." And he got out his warrant card, and it was a proper warrant card, so I got out my press card and said, "Look, I'm a real journalist." You know, serious. He was serious. They then said we would be taken to Menwith Hill Police Station, and so they set off in convoy down Archway in the wrong direction. These were the elite of Britain's police, remember, but eventually, using the intelligence skills to which they'd been trained, they stopped a taxi driver who very kindly led them to Menwith Hill Police Station, where we were duly put in jail, where we clearly belonged. So that was 3 of us. Myself, Crispin Aubrey worked for Time Out. Sadly, Crispin died last year. And John Berry, who's a social worker then, the ex-soldier. He's still living and still a social worker out in Somerset. And we were charged under this discredited law, starting an outrage. So severe a threat to national security we were that the whole of the top floor of Brixton Prison's maximum security wing was cleared out for us. You're talking heavy stuff here. You're talking the craze, the gangsters, the spies like Blake, the rapists and poisoners and murderers. They were not the big threat compared with 2 Oxford graduates and 1 social worker. The whole top wing was cleared out, and some very bewildered warders also wondered what part of their world had changed when these terribly gentle and polite and nice people just came in, and they were told that they must speak to no one under any circumstances. It was a slightly scary time. It got worse. We did get out on bail quite quickly. The event is going to be told in a biography of the QC, Lord Hutchinson, who defended me in the subsequent case. Jeremy, I just met him last couple of weeks ago. After many years, he's now 99, he's going to make 100, and there's a book going to be out about his case. And so we were recalling the events, amazingly. But when we made bail, the QC who represented us was the playwright John Mortimer. And knowing the nuances of British society, Mortimer made a point of stressing to the judge, who he asked to sort of prize us out, get us out of this Brixton nonsense, that we were very decent people, decent family, well-educated, went to Oxford. And the judge said, you know, speaking of me, said, "What college?" "Oh, Brasenose." I said, "Oh, what then?" Those of you who keep up with these social mores will know that David Cameron, I regret, followed me some years later through Brasenose College, Oxford. The Aegean Hosenball faced a star chamber to be asked about their doings, and this map came up at the center of it. So with great delight, I was able to tell them, no, I didn't have a secret squirrel inside Cheltenham. I did it on my bicycle and with the phone books. Don't know if they believed me. They don't always find the truth easy to take. But we were there. That's a rather hairier me from the time with Crispin and John, and we were set for trial. And because of the discredit of the law, they charged us with espionage. So Crispin and I and John were all charged with Section 1, which is the full-on spying section, which adds another 14 years to the 2 years for breaking Section 2. And even that wasn't good enough for them, because they went down to Brighton, where I then lived, and they, with a search warrant, but it wasn't a search warrant, they just stripped my flat, took everything I got, every book, every piece of paper, and they decided I was too nosy. So they made up a new charge that I had collected too much information about secret matters. Not secret information, not official information, not even making any sense, but too much. And I was charged with collecting information for a purpose prejudicial to the safety or interests of the state. You might think this is the definition of what a journalist ought to do. The times were slightly different, especially if you sat in Cheltenham. That's the original indictment. We're going to put some of this online on the Intercept site, and the transcript of the discussions, although bits of it have been published, we're going to publish that at the end of the week or whenever the Intercept comes out. It's not that there's anything sensational there, but it again shows the manic obsessive secrecy. They transcribed what we'd said, they stamped secret on every page, and that not being good enough, they went and wrote top in front of every word, secret, top and bottom, and then went back and revisited it with a proper top secret red stamp, just to make sure the message got across. They produced anonymous witnesses, and this was where the bubble burst. The witnesses had to be kept from us, they said at the beginning. They were going to bring an army officer, but he would be called Lieutenant Colonel A. And so the rather Dickensian magistrates up at Tottenham were persuaded by their clerk that this wasn't on. Panic ensued. They decided that this Lieutenant Colonel was far too secret to come anywhere near the exposure of having his name written down on a secret piece of paper. They'd send us a full colonel instead. Now, the Army publishes magazines for all its different regiments about different activities, and I'd been reading them for several years. And I knew from reading these magazines who the colonels were who'd have anything to say on this subject. So I got all the clippings together, ready for this case, and Colonel B turned up. And he was asked to write down his name on a secret piece of paper, which was shown to the lawyer. And the lawyer, Geoffrey Robertson, who's now a distinguished civil rights lawyer, Geoffrey turned round and said, "You're right." And I handed him a sheaf of articles, all from Army magazines, all about Colonel B. And Colonel B was then shown these articles, which described his activities, how many people he commanded, where his base was, and even in one quote called him the dawn of the communications underworld. And this was great fun. And the clerk, who was a wonderfully Dickensian person, said, "Mr. Robertson, you're putting article after article to this witness, and you're not giving references. Could the witness please say what he is reading from?" And nobody thought about it. These are supposed to be intelligence people and spooks and so on. And he reads out, "Well, I'm reading from the Wire magazine of November 1968 at page 30. Back of the court of all these journalists saying, right, you remember Bletchley Park and the cribs and Lake Enigma? They've just been handed their crib. To decode Colonel B's secret identity, go to a library, get out this magazine, this page, this edition, and you got it." And thus there began a secrecy wild goose chase. His name was printed on badges, on leaflets handed out, which the police would try as scorned. It was drawn in the sand at the NUJ's annual conference. And the police came along after the General Secretary of the NUJ, but then the tide washed away the evidence. Eventually, in Parliament, a number of courageous Labour MPs, or Labour was the government of the day, thought enough is enough, and in live broadcasting of Parliament, which had just started, they named the name. And this resulted in the Director of Public Prosecutions sending out an urgent dispatch to all editors that it would still be absolutely unlawful to name this secret name in our case, even though it had been disreputably mentioned in Parliament and broadcast to the entire world and carried on Radio Moscow. And even the conservative newspapers broke at this point. The Times felt obliged to deprecate us, but recalled that it had been born as a radical pamphleteering organ thing, which founded its reputation on the right to the untrammeled reporting of Parliament. And the name went in. And that was a turning point. Quite recently, I've been going through my archives and I found a summary I'd written for a potential book at the end of 1977 as I was facing 30 years imprisonment. And I was quite astonished to see how optimistic I was, and even more astonished to read in my own hand at the time that I'd successfully predicted the outcome of our case, that it would fall apart and that the secrecy that had been behind it would become a laughingstock. And that is eventually what happened, despite the three of anonymous witnesses and the rest of it. The result of that was that GCHQ became very well known indeed, because all the witnesses had to talk about it. The trial fell apart because witness after witness came along and said, well, I'm from a secret place, and then were asked to read newspaper articles, official publications, press releases. It just became an absurdity. It did represent a high watermark of overreaching, but as we have seen just in the last year or so, the secret state has hardly retreated in its venomous determination to see that nothing should be learned about the scale of secret surveillance, if at all possible. Because of this, we got a stream of other whistleblowers who came forward. One who sadly now died had come from Hong Kong, had fought for years inside GCHQ without success to expose massive frauds on the secret budget because it was uncountable. The quotation, "We have a secret vote, we are freelancers, we can spend what we like," came from a tape recording clandestinely made by the unhappy ex-spouse of one of the government servants who'd built nearly £1 million from the taxpayer by exploiting allowances and property charges that GCHQ was prepared to pay. Did the government want to know? No. Did the whistleblower achieve anything until he came to the press? No. While he was inside the government service, his name was Jock Kane, he's long since been out, he was taken out of Hong Kong, which was a plum posting, and he was sent to that wee station on the hilltop in Fife, which was about the least interesting place in GCHQ to go do radio listening. They didn't sack him, but they sure as hell pushed him out of the way. In 1980, we also investigated the very large listening station in the middle of Yorkshire at Menwith Hill. This is hugely wide into British telecommunications, and we'd been able to map it. This story was paired at massive expense for the Sunday Times newspaper. And a reporter and I went to America, interviewed lots and lots of people, got some amazing quotes about the place. I've just recently been in touch because of this collision of articles with that reporter, and she reminded me that one of our sources who said to go to the station and look for the cables that connected them because he knew about the cables because he was on an NSA advisory board. I'd forgotten it. This is being broadcast, and I'm not yet sure whether when we look back at our names, we can give that name out in a public forum. That's about the etiquette of journalism. But the person concerned is preeminent in computing on the same level as Alan Turing. He's also now deceased, which is why it may be possible to name him. But this story, which was the Snowden story of its generation, they're massively backed up by American sources of some distinction, never made it into the Sunday Times. And we published it instead with much less impact in my magazine at the time, which was the New Statesman. It was entitled America's Big Year in Europe. The cover said the billion-dollar phone tap. And that's how it was wired into the British communication system. You've seen these maps? As Edward Snowden's documents reveal the cable tapping. It was happening in the 1960s, 1970s, and all the way through. It goes back to the 1920s. And that is the story of the access to cables, first told, but the impact completely defeated by the big jackboot. Now, actually, as we speak, a letter is being prepared to Harry Evans, who was our editor at the time. He's now Sir Harold Evans. He's living in New York. Linda and I, Linda who co-this, we're going to ask Harry if he will now reveal the pressure on him that stopped that story going onto the front page of the Sunday Times and perhaps changing the history of surveillance. Also, amusingly, if you've read The Intercept, you might read a story where James Bamford, the American author, had got hold of a top-secret Justice Department report which said that the NSA and CIA were guilty of illegal electronic surveillance. And that's the cover of the report, as published in The Intercept magazine at the start of October. I read that story and I thought, wait a minute. I've seen that document. I know that document. I've used that document. And James had described how he had been cornered by legal agents from the Justice Department after Reagan came into office. They specifically changed an American law to allow documents to be reclassified. They visited him in Boston, and they started asking very strange questions. And he panicked, and he got on his phone to his attorney in Washington. And the attorney with the American Civil Liberties Union said, James, get the hell out. I'll keep them talking. Tell them to come to the phone. When they take the phone from you, go through the door and don't look back. Don't come back. And that's what he did. And he described in The Intercept that he then contacted a British reporter who arranged for another reporter leaving Boston that night to get a copy of the document out of America. And 2 days ago, we found it. It's here. I've been looking after it for 30 years. And it is the explicit investigation, as Bamford said in his Intercept piece. The scale of the criminality revealed was so severe that the discussion was about issuing them with formal warnings before they were questioned. But of course, with Reagan in office, all of that was suppressed. In 1988, I went to California and met a source who'd worked at that Menwith Hill Station. And she told me about a new surveillance system which had the name of ECHELON. How many people haven't heard of ECHELON? It's probably the right answer. Nobody. Everybody's heard of ECHELON who's come to this talk. ECHELON became very controversial. And there were people for many years who didn't believe any of it, didn't believe that mass surveillance could exist on this kind of scale. There may be still some people who don't believe it's the real project that happened. I'm going to make a little coded prediction that in 2 weeks there will be no one who can hold that position reasonably. However, in 1988, yes, in 1988, this story, like the eavesdroppers, had zero impact. We wrote it, nobody paid attention. You know, so the lesson is that you can get stuff out, but it's also about the impact and the authority with which you do it, which is another lesson from the Snowden revelations. And what I now know, piecing many more things together, but didn't know at the time, is that this project began in 1966 at the start of the era of communication satellites. Now we're all used to fibers, But before optical fibers, there were copper wires across the ocean, but they were not ever terribly good, and the satellites became the main thing in the 1960s. And in the 1960s, at the height of the Cold War, NSA launched projects of equal priority to spy on Soviet satellites, which we would understand, and at the same time to spy on new Western satellites, the Intelsat satellites. Now, in these first years, Intelsat was the creature of the West only. It wasn't going to carry Soviet communications or Chinese communications. It was primarily going to link America to Europe. And the Americans were desperate to have the system tapped, but not from the United States. So they paid for the construction of the first equipment at Bude in Cornwall, where this now happens. And this is now the epicenter of the tapping of the internet, the Bude station of GCHQ. These are the stations, and one of the other things that James Bamford uncovered when he did his research was letters from in the archives of one of the former directors of NSA, from a guy called Joe Hooper, who was the guy who was so desperate to have me put away for 30 years. The letters at one stage talk about, I like the way that our people are are in bed together and the sheets are tugged snugly around them, which is an extraordinary level of intimacy. But he also said, thank you for your help. I had to lean on you so much with our treasury here in Britain that the aerials at Bude should be called Pat and Lou. That's after the director of NSA. That was the foundation stone. Because in the middle of the Cold War, when most people, all people, would have supported surveillance and intelligence and listening that was dealing with holding off a nuclear war threat, their equal priority was to start mass surveillance, essentially looking back on America, as far as satellites started out, with those huge antennae mimicking ones which were built in Maine and at Goonhilly in Britain to carry those first communications across the Atlantic. And that is the pattern that we see in all of the Snowden revelations running over the last 18 months, right up to the Channel 4 program that some of you may have seen last week. Pat and Lou. The initial deployment of ECHELON was targeted only on communication satellites, and as the constellation grew, a couple more stations were added in the northwestern US, in Hong Kong, and in the eastern seaboard of the United States. And that is my article in 1988. So if we go back, this, which you'll probably see again in the Intercept in a few days or so, and this, that's me missing the evidence that's before my eyes. If we recast this story, how would you know? But there it is. This antenna was built to spy on the satellite over the Atlantic, and you can see the other one at a low angle is heading to the satellite over the Indian Ocean. So literally, in step with the building of the modern era of communications, and then computers and internet communications, all that we've seen, the spies were there every step of the way. What Snowden reveals is not the creature of post 9/11 or the creature of responding to ISIS. It is in the nature of the secret establishments and their growth. ECHELON set the standard for the surveillance we now see. I'm in an audience of techies, so I can fairly, at least I think I am, can fairly say what went on. It was based on the then novel idea, but now intuitively familiar if you're more than about 7 years old, of text searching by indexing all the text, searching them, and then be able to put the index or search terms. Prior to ECHELON, the searches were manual. Things were printed out, and there was a watch list of people and targets, and analysts went through and, oh, this one belongs, and yes, this should be sent on, and this one doesn't matter. So ECHELON also became the first automated surveillance system, and the ECHELON dictionary system, which I think its second generation was supported on VAXes, was the way of doing it. So the target words and all the stuff, we're intuitively familiar with this because we're the generation that has either built or grown up with search engines and free text search technologies. But in the 1960s and 70s, these technologies were only ever heard of in the intelligence agencies, and their scale and power hard to grasp outside. So they matched keywords and lists and targets. And that again, the 1988 story, a fundamental break. The reporting, albeit 20 years after it began, of the start of the era of mass surveillance, and in the great British and world press, a great big zip. And then, in New Zealand, a very diligent local author who will actually be over speaking the latest sessions at what's called the Logan Symposium. It's being held in the Barbican from Friday through Sunday. Nicky Hager utilized the fact that New Zealand was a very small country and you could pretty well find people who knew people and persuade them to talk. And he uncovered a great deal about ECHELON and published it in this 1996 book. Whoops. So well known now is the station he uncovered that you can pop into your local wine store and buy, if we go back, these are vineyards around the station there. If you want to buy Spy Valley, it's a nice Sauvignon Blanc, nice good South Island, New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. And these grapes come from meters away from New Zealand's ECHELON satellite listening station. In the late 1990s, just by happenstance, Nicky's work and mine came to the attention of the European Parliament. And they commissioned some reports for an assessment panel, and then in 1999 got me to write this document, which I like to think, you can go get it on the internet, you can get it on my website. I think it stands the test of time as being a very cool, technically literate, scientific appraisal of just what these technologies could do. This time we were being taken seriously. This time the European Parliament asked for reports, and I was asked to go talk to the Bundestag, to the Japanese Diet, to quite a number of European parliaments, as well as the European Parliament itself. And they received my report, and they appointed a commission of parliamentarians and other experts to essentially go check everything I'd done, which is fine. And that took another year, through 2000, and they produced another report with massive recommendations about the controls over secret surveillance. That was put before the European Parliament, and it was passed overwhelmingly, every single resolution. The date on which it was passed was the 5th of September, 2001. 6 days later, the attacks in Washington and New York, and you know what happened. So the world then changed, and this was forgotten until a review, and until Edward Snowden. The report is there, I'm just scooping through. One of the mistakes that was made, we now know, is only a small proportion of international communications are transmitted via satellites. Transmissions via fiber optic are much more difficult to intercept. That, we know, was wrong. 3 years at least before 9/11, the NSA started its plan with GCHQ to break into and basically take ownership of the internet. And they have done that now at such scale in so many ways that I imagine many of you are boggling as I do as to what we're going to find out next week is broken. Believe me, there's still a lot more you're going to find out is broken. But it began long before the change of atmosphere. In the height of the Cold War, they were still continuing on this mission. They appointed panels in Washington to research the re-automation of gathering signals out of the internet. Initially, they were taking it from telex or telegraph signals in dictionary. Then they started calling computer-to-computer, C2C communications, and that was in the 90s. And then they changed to digital network intelligence, DNI. And now literally billions, tens of billions of DNI events, every single internet interchange, TCP or IP or other protocols, is catalogued off the collection. and put through analysis and sifting processes. It is scaled up at a level which, to even us as technologists on the whole, find very difficult to comprehend. At this point, folks, I'm conscious that I'm running over time, but I may be holding your attention. I've got a little bit more to say about me, and I can canter through some Snowden stuff, or I can come to an earlier conclusion. Could those who would like me to move to a quicker conclusion say aye? And those who would like me to take more time to go through stuff say aye? Aye. Very parliamentary of you. I thank you for your conversion protocol. Also in 1999, we discovered, with the help of a keen observer in the north of England, that an extraordinary system had been built in the area of Cheshire, a place called Capenhurst, which actually worked ordinarily as part of the nuclear weapons fabrication cycle. Sorry, could you, it's quite slightly. At this place, they had built this extraordinary tower. Sadly, we only knew about it when it was put up for sale, having been decommissioned. And you can read this stuff on the website, the guy who found it got in touch with me and said, this seems to have been built precisely in the path of a microwave link between Dublin and Manchester, which at the time was carrying all of the Irish Republic's international communications. And I was initially a bit skeptical, but we worked it through, and it was built, there was no question, it was built exactly in the middle of the beam, and we went up to the different hills and we did it on maps, and yes, it was going to get it. And then we looked at the plans which had been filed at the local authority office, and it had a precise magnetic bearing on which the steel structure had to be erected. Internally, that's a cylinder, but there was a steel square structure inside it, and it was accurate to 2 levels of decimal. Well, that's a bit strange. You know, even Stonehenge wasn't built to that precision. And we made a plan to check it out. So it's up for sale, so hey, let's go see it. So I approached Channel 4, my TV company, made the suggestion that this was a mass surveillance system that was targeting Ireland. They bought the idea, so we went to make the program. Would we make a secret approach to buy the place? I thought, no, you can get away with it. My company was called IPTV. This was a communications installation. The kind of people who were going to show us around it wouldn't figure out that we possibly weren't going to broadcast TV from there. It seemed kind of reasonable, so we just told them who we were. Used all our real names, so we didn't have to go undercover. And it was a bit of science, because we knew from the plans that there would be antenna there and equipment there, and if it was doing what we thought it was doing, they would have had to put antenna precisely aligned to that square structure of the steelwork on the precise compass bearing, proving that it was pointing into each of the signals coming from Manchester and coming from Dublin. And we had to get it on film. So we put our plan in progress by going there and having extra people to distract them while the cameraman filmed me. We said we needed to film the thing for our directors who couldn't come. And in the critical moment, which we had to rehearse in a simulation outside, the cameraman would follow me up while the others tripped or did something so that our minders were stuck at the bottom, get up there, see where the holes in the floor were, did they align with the steelwork, film them, explain them, and then be smiling as the Ministry of Defence people eventually came up the stair. And the holes were there. You can see the film on my website. This was the proof of the surveillance of all Irish communications, and it became a case before the European Court of Human Rights, eventually ruling that this kind of surveillance was illegal. But we were talking about a surveillance system that was built in the 90s at the time of the before the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act, which allows GCHQ to do this stuff. And the government said, GCHQ said, oh shucks, well, we've changed the law, so it doesn't matter. Of course, we comply now. And there was no way of taking that back. Now, Downstairs on the way in, I met some people from Privacy International, friends. Did Eric? He didn't come up, did he? No. And they are just in the middle of the stages of a new case to the European Court of Human Rights, along with some others, on the same basis. Whether it will get us anywhere when the ruling of illegality is, there'll be a new emergency law, probably, and stuff like that. So, there's some other war stories that I could tell, especially about getting out a story from the BBC of a satellite from called Zircon, which was GCHQ's plan to catch up with the Americans. There's a lot more of this on the website. The funniest thing is, if you're interested in this, you can see the program I made for the BBC. And like the story about Menwith Hill that was suppressed, like the other stories that didn't get attention, the BBC program was also suppressed after the GCHQ put pressure on the BBC Director General, Alistair Milne. We got the program out because we saw what was coming. It didn't stop the attacks. They raided me, they raided my magazine New Statesman, and then when Thatcher got even more furious, they went and raided the offices of the BBC in Glasgow and took out all the program tapes. But we got the story out. It's a rather amusing program to watch if you can, because we had no documents. We didn't have an Edward Snowden. No one was going to talk to camera and say this is true. What we had was the former chief scientist of the Ministry of Defence, Professor Sir Ronald Mason, slightly unfairly, but you will understand, in an interview to talk about the importance of satellites for intelligence. At the end of a question, I said, Professor, what difference will be made by the new projects for satellite intelligence, in particular Zircon? And Professor Mason went, I can't talk to you about that. I said, so you're saying everything about Zircon is completely secret? Yeah, I'm sorry. Bingo. I always, when I'm teaching journalism, I always tell that story because it's, if you're a written journalist, the story becomes, man in interview says nothing. Whereas if you film it and put it on television, the saying nothing is the story and tells the message and was the confirmation of GCHQ's project. After that, there was a sort of silly war in which Nigel Lawson attempted to claim that he'd already banned Zircon before I exposed it. It was, by all accounts, and particularly NSA's account, another daft GCHQ plan to try and expand its empire, and they ended up handing the money to the Americans instead and becoming subservient. Tactical break in discussion. I'll just coast through some of the what do we know now that adds to all of this investigation thanks to Edward Snowden. Answer a hell of a lot, and there's more coming. But perhaps the most significant and indeed sinister is the phrase collect it all. You might have seen this come up once in a Guardian report last year, but it's all over the place as the future strategy of NSA. They want to take everything. Even in this area of massively multiplying communications, they want to have everything pass through their sensors, be sifted, be analyzed, and if they've got the slightest interest and one analyst has pressed a switch, to stick it into the bins in the massive data centers that are being built around the world, particularly in Utah, but also in Washington itself, in Texas, in Georgia, in Hawaii, and here in the United Kingdom. There's another one just been announced 2 days ago. This is a scary and ununderstood new world which Snowden has taken the lid off. This is the scale of it. And the type of things. You're talking about cable interceptions, these blue circles. You're talking about satellite interceptions. Foreign satellite is the new name for ECHELON. They have 12 major sites. But also, most of the nations of Europe and many other countries around the world, 50 of them have been roped into the whole surveillance empire by secret deals that their agencies make under the nose of national politicians with GCHQ. This is why the European Union is so neutered in dealing with this surveillance. They are compromised from within by a long-term program of subversion, just as merchant banks like Goldman Sachs have done with national treasuries and economic advisors, leading to that wonderful phrase of the vampire squid. Wonderfully, I did a piece for the Register, something I said, who was it, Joe, who came up with five-eyed vampire squid? Was it?
I think it was Lewis.
Lewis, okay. Lewis is the editor of the Reg, so I love it. It combines the two very, very clearly. The 5 English-speaking countries are called the Five Eyes, so there we are. The cables, optical fiber cables tapped, satellites monitored, and then something like 80 listening stations built in the center of capital cities using embassy premises to scoop up the whole radio spectrum. And finally, and most significantly, malware. They call it implants. It's the biggest growth area in Cheltenham and in Fort Meade, the NSA headquarters. And the world that we're in of computers and IT is just beginning to learn the scale of national threats. Many of you will have seen in the last few days the Regin virus or malware suite being analyzed. It almost certainly matches to particular standard components of NSA and GCHQ's infection platforms. One of them's out there, it's called Validator. There's quite a few others. But they are core, ultra-professional, multitasked with many, many modules, all of them devoted to gathering intelligence. The hardware of the internet in the United Kingdom, at many locations, as well as in the United States and other, isn't just access to take signals, but to put in equipment there which is able to interfere with packets in the course of transmission, so that they can target individual people based on one of the selectors, the IP address, the email address, the stuff they use, and send malware back, try and hijack the link. We know that the Stuxnet virus, for example, exploited the Microsoft update channel and used some very, very rare collision hashes in the ciphers to spoof but get validated the communications channel, but to take it over so that they were getting NSA updates instead of Microsoft updates. There's going to be a lot more than malware from the surveillance people that I think you'll be reading about in the next months or years. This will go on. This particular slide said that by this stage there were 50,000 actively compromised computers with implements. Other figures in the Snowden papers go up to millions. These are the countries that collaborate, not just the 5 English-speaking countries, but third parties all across the place. If you look at this and try and see which companies in Europe aren't compromised, this of course is top secret, avert your eyes. Which countries aren't compromised? Well, there's Monaco, there's Liechtenstein, there's Iceland, and Ireland. Yes, Switzerland isn't there, but I think it belongs there. It's just even, they have a compartment above top secret, which is called exceptionally compartmented intelligence. Having seen the modern American equipment in the Swiss SIGINT stations and knowing that the ECHELON program is about the Americans paying for the equipment and the local station people providing the staff, that's what's going on. So you've got 5 English-speaking countries, 30 third parties, 90 commercial partners, 20 major points like the whole of Cornwall, cable accesses, covert cable accesses tucked into the cables without the knowledge of the communications companies. The Channel 4 program last week was about that being done against the flag optical fiber cables which come in on one side of Cornwall, cross over, and leave on the other to go to Europe and Asia. Right in the middle, a massive tap to GCHQ, taking all the data and allowing for malware insertion as well. This stuff shouldn't be legal, but they get away with it. Embassy surveillance sites, civil satellite sites. That's ECHELON now from one of the Snowden slides. And that's a modern ECHELON station in Denmark, one of the countries which wasn't very enthusiastic about the European Parliament investigations. And then there's this stuff. This is the heart of Germany. This is the Brandenburger Tor, the Brandenburg Gate. heart of so much European history of the 20th century. And this, right beside it, is on top of the American embassy, you can guess. And these, folks, are dielectric panels. Do I need to explain dielectrics? What happens with dielectrics? Radio waves go through. So this is the bugging center that the Americans built in the 21st century in unified Germany to spy on their allies, like Chancellor Merkel. We had some fun with infrared. Say again? They are not growing marijuana. Nice one. Yeah, this is the cover story coming through. On a cold night in Berlin, you can see, and you can actually see the structure of the electronic racks at this resolution, burning heat. Now, the funny thing about this picture is that the people who were doing it, they went back with another infrared camera to try the next day. I don't know if I got that slide. No, I don't. But it had cooled down. The temperature had dropped 5 or 6 degrees, which was really surprising. Now, we don't know for sure, but that night that this first picture was taken, President Obama met Chancellor Merkel in Brussels. And that was the time that she raised her ire about her personal targeting in NSA's database. So it may be that when Obama gave the undertaking that she wasn't going to be targeted again, he also gave the order to turn that lot off, at least for now. America is not alone, of course. This is the top of the British Embassy in Berlin, built at the same time, and that is not a water tank. It's packed full of signals intelligence antenna and the whole full of computer equipment to support it. And you can go on to Google Earth, which amazingly has modeled it. I don't know if the 3D modeler knew what they were creating, but there it is. And you can see, using Google Earth, that it has line of sight to the Bundestag and to the Federal Chancellery. That is the degree of audacity of GCHQ. I had an interesting dinner a few months ago at Chatham House, and I was sat opposite Sir John Sawyer, who used to be the head of SIS. Beside me was somebody from the German embassy who pretended to be a science counselor, but another of the Germans there said, no, he's the B&D representative, he's the local head of station. And we were having a talk about this, and he told me that just to make a show about this issue, when I published this story in The Independent in Britain, they did send some federal police around to the British Embassy to ask for an inspection. They were, of course, told to go away because diplomatic premises are protected by the Vienna Convention. But in order to show the German mood, the ambassador was summoned to the foreign ministry and was only seen by a third secretary. Now, in diplomatic terms, this is slap about the face with a wet fish a couple of times, kick up the ass once and throw flour over you. Or put less colourfully, it was formerly the biggest rift diplomatically between Britain and Germany since 1936. Happily.
1939 it got worse.
No, I don't think, but in the summoning of the ambassador, I think. If your history is better than mine, I stand corrected. Okay, moving on quickly through Snowden. The communications companies are compromised. You've read about it. They build in backdoors. I've done stories about Microsoft doing it. Cisco not only collaborated, but was humiliated when Glenn Greenwald in his book published pictures of a Cisco router being taken out of the postal system and specifically tampered. And this week's reports, no doubt in the Register, maybe somebody wrote it, has reported that Cisco stock has lost, 20% of its value in developing. The Cisco stock is down 10%, developing markets are down 20 or 30%, and they are going to have a problem. The problem is, if America is going to compromise security for the rest of the world, none of us should trust their equipment, their algorithms, their standards, or any damn thing. No doubt you'll have some useful comments on that in a minute. So in 2014, mass electronic surveillance is a reality. Their goal is all the content all the time, quote unquote. 35 countries are effectively in this alliance, not 5. The new push is marketing. They get all this information, what are they got to do? So they've got to start interfering in society. But they don't want to reveal what they do. So there's a whole stratagem, you can see the literature about it, of parallel explanations. They're becoming active. Not just national security targets, but you've seen from the GCHQ material, they're attacking attackers, they're attacking activists, they're trying to colonize areas of policing. Not that we don't support the detection and prosecution of crimes, but it is intolerable in an accountable civil society that is prosecuted by an intelligence agency which has no accountability and will specifically, deliberately and knowingly lie to the courts about what they do. And in this heap of ordure, the United Kingdom is unquestionably the worst and the most and the least restrained. You've heard about PRISM and its upstream-downstream collection. This Project Tempora is how it works. The cables mainly come in to the southwest of England and they're siphoned off to Bude or to Cheltenham. This is probably access point Nigella, as revealed on Channel 4 last week. This is where the Indian cables are tapped and then taken up to Bude. In the register, not so long ago, I was able, thank you guys, and thank you Joe and Lewis especially, to report a story that I could not get, and the Guardian was terrified to publish. I tried to get it into the Independent, but they were stomped on. It took a while for us to get our act together, but we got it out and revealed that GCHQ has got another major internet interception center sitting in the middle of the Middle East in Oman. Sweden does the dirty tricks for the agencies in the Baltic, and even the French play along despite noises to the contrary. These are the 7 major exit points from the United States on cable networks, all code-named for ski resorts, where the American companies, particularly AT&T and Verizon, and just as in this country, the British Telecom and Cable and Wireless, which has recently been taken over, they are wired in and have been wired in for decades, swapping personnel, building in surveillance to the networks for which they are common carriers. The scaling up of this is massive. This is, again, early Snowden, 500 million pieces of German metadata a month. This is what GCHQ now boasts it can do through the mastering the internet, 50 billion events a day. An NSA slide on metadata is taking them to the 1,000 billion or so, with 1 or 2 billion records being permanently stored every day. Those of you who do hard-edge data processing will know Hadoop, will know MapReduce. One of the comforting things is there's no magic in NSA systems. As the noughties have progressed, the more what goes on in NSA looks like stuff that big data people do in the outside world, just unimaginably bigger. So the searching of the entire activity of the internet is done by a parsing analytical structure called X-keyscore. It's supported on Hadoop and MapReduce distributed platforms. I wish I understood more of what I was talking about here. If anybody wants to give me a tutorial, I'm open to that. And these feedings in are from special source operations, which means tapping the optical fibers, FORNSAT, ECHELON, and F6, which is embassies. So that's the global surveillance system. And as a recent article that my chum Ryan Gallagher did for The Intercept described it, it's a Google for everything that happens on the internet, the private stuff. And this is how they push it out. That was just a very recent article showing that the way that in order to market what they get, they're trying to reach for outreach so that more people want to use their surveillance. But no accountability, complete secrecy. Europe is targeted. Economics and commercial information is targeted. Skype is ruthlessly used. And they have broken and determined to break all of the cryptographic tools that underline the security of what we try and do. They call this enabling, and this is part of the forward cryptologic plan. Enabling means breaking in NSA speak. Enabling encryption chips used in VPN and web encryption. Make gains in enabling decryption in 4G and LTE networks. Access wireless calling data. Access cyber information flows. Continue relationships with commercial IT partners and capitalize on new opportunities. Everything is subverted, everything is targeted, and much is broken, and there's a lot of realization still to go on. It's not just used for surveillance, but for attack. The turmoil system is used to do real-time identification of encryption, spotting the content, to stuff back. We now know that they are the biggest hackers in the world. The code name is CNE, Computer Network Exploitation. Fox acid, and this makes you wonder. You know, when I took on GCHQ the first time, they were Cold War warriors. They were people who'd maybe been on my mother's generation in the war when the stuff was real, or faced the real risks of the Cold War and potential nuclear warfare. Now, it's the undisciplined, amoral kiddies. Some of us may have hacked or been hackers. We all know hackers. And they're hackers too. Hackers don't have the discipline, for better and for worse, that people who served in the military did. They don't have the discipline of the civil service organizations. If it's cool, they want to do it. If there's something out there that they can't break, they want to break it. And they've got an unlimited budget, indemnity from all illegal prosecution. All they have to do is produce something that their peers who are of similar mind think is cool. This is a danger beyond measure. When James Bamford and me and our like worried in the 70s about agencies going rogue, this, like everything else, is going rogue at scale. And this Fox acid, I should have said, Fox acid is the exploit server at the heart of NSA. There's almost certainly a Fox acid at Menwith Hill Station. There's probably a Fox acid at Scarborough, where there's another GCHQ site. There may well be one down in Cornwall. It's all about the timing of internet delays, get your stuff in. Particularly, a particular attack method is to look for a target coming to a web page that you know they're going to access because they've done it before from your X-key score analysis. You set up, you've profiled their browser, you know which exploits might work. Fox acid spots the traffic and it's got to get there first. So this allows forms of attack on networks which are inconceivable from the point of view of Chinese or Russian hackers or anything of the kind. And this is the quantum system for actually doing it. Compromised routers. This is an illustration of an attack based on simulating a Yahoo web page. This is about active disruption based on the intelligence, and it's juvenile if it wasn't horrific. Leak confidential information. Post negative information. I mean, what are they? A school computer club getting out of school? This is a top secret GCHQ document, releasable only to Five Eyes. And how, in goodness name, are they serving our society, our interests, our values, if they're allowed to do this stuff and pretend that it matters or counts? But there it is. Online covert action. Deny, disrupt, degrade, or deceive. To whom is this accountable? This goes far beyond surveillance to protect us. This is active attacks. And the longer they go on unconstrained, clearly the further they go, the more dangerous it becomes. So there are these legal aspects. And finally, quasi-finally, this little slide. Many people I've talked to, quite serious people, conservative politicians, peers, who will engage in an argument about this. They don't think the same as me, but many times they come back and they've said, but we are assured, and we've always spoken to the chiefs, and they said, the Americans do not spy on us. Here, from an American document, is the answer. This agreement has evolved to include a common understanding, but when it's in the best of interest of each nation, each reserves the right to conduct unilateral comment action against each other's citizens and persons. And once you've done that, once you've written that, once that is the understanding, the door, of course, is open, and the assurances to the grandees of Parliament are worth nothing. The purpose of the last 14 or 15 years of constructing this architecture, we have been assured, is to protect us from terrorism. And after some of the horrors of 2001 and after, July 7th, and indeed whatever has caused it, what is happening in the Middle East now, these are horrors. But the American government was made to account for the mass surveillance that has been revealed in the last year and a half, with 3 successive commissions going to investigate whether this surveillance had stopped any terrorist plots. And the final answer was none. The best they could claim for ingesting thousands of billions of records and holding them in the system was they detected a taxi driver in California who'd wired some funds to a terrorist suspect abroad. No terror plot stopped, but all of the personal information of Americans taken. And of course, in America, they don't care about us. We are the rest of the world. Thank you for your attention. Lots of stuff is on my website. I await questions.